The alarm did not wait for me to finish my coffee. It cut through the mess hall like a blade, 3 short bursts and then a long one. The kind of sound that every pilot on Calder Station had been trained to obey without thinking. I was on my feet before the cup hit the table. Coffee splashed across the metal surface and ran onto the floor, and I stepped over it without looking down. A voice came over every speaker on the station at once. Not a voice I knew. Not a voice with rank attached to it. No name. No call sign. Nothing but words. Run. That was the entire message. One word, repeated 3 times, then silence. No coordinates. No destination. No explanation of what we were running from. Though by then I think every person on that station already knew. The Korath ships had been sitting at the edge of our system for 6 days, calling it a routine patrol, the same lie they had used for 60 years of trade and treaties and shared border space. 6 days of routine patrol, and then one word over every speaker in human space. I ran for the hangar. The corridors were already full, people moving in every direction, some toward the evacuation shuttles, some toward weapons lockers that had not been opened in a decade, some just standing still, looking up at the ceiling as if the order might explain itself if they waited long enough. It would not. Nobody was coming to explain anything. I grabbed a boy by the shoulder, maybe 9 years old, standing frozen in the middle of the hallway with a toy ship clutched in both hands, and pointed him toward the shuttle bay. He ran. I kept moving. My ship was called the Wayfinder. Small, fast, built for short hauls between stations, never meant for what I was about to ask of her. I hit the ramp control, and the door dropped open before I had even reached it, because the system already knew what was coming. Calder Station had drilled evacuation 100 times. Nobody had ever believed it would matter. 20 seats. I counted 20 seats and a jump seat in the cockpit that nobody was supposed to use, and within 90 seconds every one of them was full. A woman with a baby wrapped against her chest. 2 boys who looked enough alike to be brothers, neither one crying, both of them too scared to cry. An old man in a station maintenance uniform who kept saying the same sentence over and over, quiet, like a prayer. I did not catch the words. I did not have time to. I sealed the ramp at the 90-second mark because the proximity sensor on my console had started screaming, and screaming sensors do not wait for stragglers. The Korath ships were already inside the outer marker. I had seen Korath ships before. Everyone had. They came through human space twice a year on trade runs, long silver vessels shaped like folded paper, beautiful in the way that something built for elegance rather than war can be beautiful. The ships coming through the outer marker were not those ships. These were dark, angular, stripped of every curve that had made the trade vessels easy to look at. War does that to a design. It strips away anything that does not serve killing. I pulled the Wayfinder off the deck before the docking clamps had fully released, which cracked something in the undercarriage I did not have time to think about, and pushed her out through the open bay doors into a sky that was already on fire. Calder Station had 30,000 people on it. I do not know how many of them made it to a ship. I do not let myself do that math, even now, because the number that comes out the other side of it is not one I can carry and still fly straight. The first wave of Korath fire hit the station's outer ring 40 seconds after I cleared the bay doors. I felt it through the hull, a pressure wave rolling out into open space, and I did not look back, because looking back was a thing pilots did in stories, not a thing pilots did when 20 people behind them were trusting their lives to the back of a chair they could not see. Run, the voice had said, not fight, not hold the line, run. I had spent 4 years training for combat scenarios that all assumed we would have warning, that we would have time to form up, that the fleet would meet whatever came through that marker with something resembling a plan. Instead, I had one word, a cracked undercarriage, and 20 strangers who were now, in every way that mattered, my entire crew. The void around Calder Station was already full of ships peeling off in every direction, not in formation, not toward any rally point I could identify on my charts. Just scattering, the way a flock of birds scatters when something lands among them. Every ship choosing its own heading as if heading mattered more than destination. I watched 2 evacuation shuttles nearly collide and then break apart from each other at the last second, both of them choosing different slices of dark sky to disappear into. Nobody was coordinating this. That was the part that frightened me more than the Korath ships themselves. An attack you can understand. An attack has a shape, a direction, a logic you can study and eventually predict. But an evacuation with no destination, no rally point, no plan beyond a single shouted word, that was something else. That was either the most foolish order ever given in the history of human space, or it was something I did not yet have the information to understand. A Korath fighter came across my bow at a distance close enough that I could see the shape of its weapon mounts, and I threw the Wayfinder into a roll that pressed every passenger flat against their harness, and made the old man stop his quiet prayer for exactly the length of the maneuver. We came out the other side of it still in one piece, which was more than I could say for the trade station that had been sitting 40 kilometers off Calder's southern ring. I watched it come apart in my rear display, a slow, bright bloom of light that I made myself stop watching after the first second, because there was nothing in that light I could do anything about, and there was a console full of fuel and trajectory numbers in front of me that I could. The boy with the toy ship had found his way to the cockpit doorway, holding onto the frame with both hands, watching the same display I had just forced myself to stop watching. I told him to sit down. He did not move. I told him again, softer this time, and he looked at me instead of the display, and something in his face made me understand that he was not seeing what I was seeing. He was seeing his home. I did not have a gentle way to take that from him, so I did not try. I just reached back, took his hand, and walked him to the nearest open seat myself, buckling the harness with one hand, while the other kept the wayfinder weaving through a debris field that had, 10 minutes earlier, been part of a station with 30,000 people on it. We cleared the debris field with the hull intact and the fuel gauge already lower than I liked. Behind us, Calder Station was a memory with smoke still rising off it. Ahead of us was open dark, no marker, no station, no fleet, nothing but the cold geometry of a system that did not care whether 20 strangers and one cracked ship made it through the night. I checked my long-range scanner out of habit, the way you check a mirror you already know is empty, and found exactly what I expected to find. Nothing. No fleet rally point broadcasting on any channel. No coordinated retreat vector. No friendly signal of any kind. Just the dying light of a station behind me and a silence ahead of me that felt less like safety and more like a held breath. I thought about the voice that had given the order. One word, 3 times, no rank, no explanation. I wondered if whoever had spoken it understood what they were asking of every pilot in human space, scattering us across the dark like seeds thrown into wind, trusting that somehow, somewhere, enough of us would land. The baby in the back of my ship began to cry. The mother shushed her, low and constant, the kind of sound that has been made by mothers since long before anyone built ships at all. The old man had started his quiet sentence again. I caught a few words of it this time. He was not praying, he was counting names. I set a heading away from the wreckage and did not look at the fuel gauge again, because looking at it would not change what it said, and I had a ship full of people who needed me to fly, not to grieve. Grieving was a thing I promised myself I would do later, if there was a later, in a quiet room with nobody watching, where it would not cost anyone anything. For now there was only the dark ahead, and the order that had sent us into it. Run. I had no idea yet that the word was not an act of panic. I had no idea that somewhere far above the burning wreck of Calder Station, in a command center I would not see for another 18 months, that single word had been chosen on purpose, weighed and measured, and sent out across human space like a stone dropped into still water. Because someone, somewhere, already understood something the rest of us were only beginning to learn. You cannot defeat an enemy you cannot find. And for the first time since humanity had built its first ship and pushed it past the edge of the atmosphere, we were about to become very, very hard to find. I did not know that yet. I only knew the dark ahead of me, the fuel gauge behind me, and 20 people who were alive because I had not stopped to think before I ran. Somewhere behind me, on a channel I was not supposed to be able to hear, a fragment of another pilot's voice broke through the static. A man, young by the sound of it, calling a name over and over, the same name. The way you call a name when you already know nobody is going to answer it. I reached for the dial to mute the channel and then stopped myself, because muting it felt like a kind of leaving, and I had already left enough behind for one night. I let it play, low, under the hum of the engines, and I flew on into the dark with that voice for company, calling a name that was not mine, into a silence that did not answer him any more than it answered me. The boy in the back seat had stopped looking at the display. He was looking at me now, the way children look at adults when they are deciding whether the adult in the room actually knows what they are doing. I did not know, not really, but I held the controls steady, and I kept the heading clean, and after a while his shoulders came down from around his ears, just a little, which was the only kind of reassurance I had to give him that night. The fuel gauge ticked lower, the voice on the dead channel went quiet, somewhere in the static, and did not come back. Ahead of us there was nothing but stars I did not have names for, and a heading I had chosen with no more information than instinct and fear. I held it anyway. There was nothing else left to hold. The fuel gauge crossed into the red 4 hours later, and that was when the Wayfinder found her first real test. I had been flying blind in the truest sense. No station to aim for, no friendly beacon, just a heading chosen on instinct and held through sheer stubbornness. The old man in the back had finally stopped his quiet counting and fallen asleep sitting upright, his chin against his chest, and the baby had cried herself out an hour earlier and gone still in her mother's arms. The 2 boys sat pressed together, awake, watching the dark through the side viewport, as if watching hard enough might produce an answer. A signal came through on an emergency band I had almost forgotten existed. A band reserved for ship-to-ship distress calls between civilians, not military traffic. I nearly missed it under the static. A voice, male, steady in a way that suggested either remarkable courage or the kind of exhaustion that flattens fear into something resembling calm. He gave coordinates, not a rally point, not a destination, just his own position and a single request: fuel to spare, or none at all. I had none to spare. I answered him anyway, because the alternative was silence, and I had already had enough silence for one night. His name was Toby Quinn, and his ship was a hauler twice the size of mine, built for cargo rather than passengers, which meant he had room and almost no fuel, while I had fuel running low and no room left to give. We met in open space an hour later, two ships drifting close enough to link a transfer line, and for 20 minutes neither of us spoke beyond the numbers required to keep the line steady. There was nothing efficient about trust between strangers in the dark. We built it anyway, out of necessity, the same way every other piece of that night had been built. When the line disconnected, he had enough fuel to reach a marker 3 systems away. I had enough to keep my passengers breathing for another day, which was not nothing. "You should come with me," he said over the comm, and there was something in the offer that was not generosity so much as plain arithmetic. 2 ships moving together stood a slightly better chance than 2 ships moving alone, even scattered as we were meant to be. I almost said yes. I had 20 people behind me who would have agreed with him in a heartbeat given the choice. I said no. I do not fully know why, even now, except that something about the order we had been given kept turning over in my mind. The strangeness of it, the lack of any rally point, the way every ship leaving Calder Station had peeled off in a different direction, as if direction itself were the point. If we were not supposed to gather, then gathering, even with one other ship, felt like a mistake I could not explain but could not ignore either. Toby did not argue. He wished me well in a voice that suggested he understood the choice better than I did, and his hauler peeled away into the dark, taking its own heading, alone, the way the order had asked of him. I did not see him again for many months. When I did, the story had changed enough that neither of us recognized the people we had been on that first night. For now there was only the next system, and the next, and the slow education of learning to live as a fugitive in a galaxy that had, until 6 days ago, considered itself at peace. The first lesson came 2 days later, in a quiet stretch of space near an abandoned mining platform that had not seen activity in a decade. I had brought the wayfinder down into its shadow to let the engines cool, and to let my passengers stretch limbs that had been folded into harness seats far longer than any of them should have had to endure. The old man, whose name I had finally learned was Edwin, helped the mother manage her daughter while I ran a hand along the ship's hull, checking the crack in the undercarriage that had been bothering me since the moment I tore us off Calder Station's deck. That was when the Korath patrol found us. Not a wave of them, not the dark angular warships I had seen at Calder, just 2 scout craft, small and fast, the kind built for searching rather than fighting, and searching was exactly what they were doing. I watched them sweep the mining platform's shadow from a distance, methodical, patient, the way a predator checks ground it already half expects to be empty. I made every passenger go still and quiet, which is a strange thing to ask of a child who has already spent 2 days being asked to be still and quiet for reasons nobody has fully explained to her. The younger of the 2 boys, whose name I learned that day was Felix, reached for his brother's hand without being told, and the 2 of them sat motionless while I powered the wayfinder down to the barest trickle of energy needed to keep us alive, hiding in the long shadow of a platform that had been dead for 10 years. The scouts passed within 2 kilometers of us and did not turn. I do not know if it was luck, or the dead platform's old hull masking our signature, or simply the size of space working in our favor the way it so rarely does. I only know that when the scouts finally peeled away toward the next system over, I sat in the pilot's seat with my hands shaking on the controls for a full minute before I trusted myself to power the engines back up. It was Edwin who spoke first, his voice rough from disuse. He said the scouts were not looking for ships. They were looking for groups. I asked him what he meant. He had spent 30 years in station logistics before retiring to Calder, the kind of work that taught a person to read patterns in things other people only saw as noise. He had watched the scout pattern long enough to notice it was not a grid search, not the kind of methodical sweep you would use to find any ship that happened to be hiding. It was a search built to find clusters, multiple signatures close together, fleets, not stragglers. That was the moment the shape of the order began to make sense to me, the same way a word makes sense the 3rd or 4th time you hear it used correctly. Run had never meant simply flee. It had meant scatter and stay scattered, because an enemy hunting for fleets would have a much harder time finding 10,000 single ships than it would finding even small clusters of 2 or 3. Toby Quinn's offer to fly together suddenly looked very different in hindsight. I had said no without understanding why. Edwin, sitting quiet and tired in the back of my ship, had just handed me the reason. I changed my flying after that. No more lingering near other distress signals longer than it took to share fuel or information. No more drifting close enough to another ship that two signatures might read as one cluster on a scanning sweep. It felt cruel, at times, to fly past another struggling vessel without stopping, knowing what I knew, but I had 20 lives behind me who were trusting that knowledge to keep them breathing, and cruelty wears different shapes depending on which side of the harness you are sitting on. We crossed 3 more systems in the following week, each one quieter than the last, each one carrying its own scars, an abandoned colony with its lights still burning and nobody left to see them. A debris field that had once been a Korath supply convoy, destroyed by something that was not us, which meant somewhere out in that scattered dark, other humans were already fighting back in whatever small, desperate ways they could manage. I found that thought more comforting than I expected to. We were not simply running, we were becoming something the Order had not bothered to name, and I was beginning to suspect that the silence around our destination, the absence of any rally point, had never been an oversight. It had been the entire plan from the very beginning. The fuel gauge climbed back towards something survivable after a careful detour through an old refueling depot that the Korath had not yet found, or had found and decided was not worth the effort to destroy. I do not know which. I did not stay long enough to find out. We took what we needed, left enough for whoever came after us, and pushed back out into the dark, with a heading that was, for the first time since Calder Station burned, beginning to feel less like flight and more like purpose. Edwin died 3 days after that, quietly, in his sleep. The way old men sometimes do when the body finally agrees to rest after refusing to for far too long. I buried him the only way space allows, which is to say I did not bury him at all, only released him into the dark with words I am still not sure were the right ones, while Felix and his brother held hands and the baby slept on, too young to understand what stillness meant on a ship that had carried so very little of it. I had not known Edwin for more than a week. I grieved him anyway, in the quiet room I had promised myself days earlier. Except the room turned out to be a cockpit at 2 a.m. ship time, with 20 fewer people, now 19, sitting silent behind me, and a galaxy ahead of us that had not finished asking what it would cost to survive it. I held the heading. There was nothing else left to hold, and by then I had started to understand that holding it was, itself, a kind of answer to the question the Korath had never bothered to ask before they turned their guns on a peace that had lasted 60 years. We were not done running, but running, I was beginning to learn, could be its own kind of weapon, if enough of us were stubborn enough to keep doing it. The next test came not from the Korath, but from ourselves. Fuel was steady again, but food was not, and water was running thinner than I liked to admit out loud. 19 mouths on a ship built to comfortably feed half that number for a fraction of the time we had already spent in transit. I rationed without announcing it as rationing, the way you do when you do not want to watch fear spread across a child's face simply because you told him the truth too plainly. Felix noticed anyway. Children always notice. He started sharing his portion with his brother without being asked, and I had to turn back to the controls for a moment before either of them could see what that did to my face. We found a trade outpost on the edge of a system I did not recognize from any chart I carried, the kind of place that existed in the gray spaces between official routes, run by people who asked questions only when the silence afterward was worth more than the answer. I traded half of what remained in my cargo hold, spare parts mostly, things scavenged from the mining platform during our brief stop there, for enough supplies to carry us another 2 weeks if we were careful. The man running the outpost, an older trader with a voice like gravel and eyes that had clearly seen more of the war than he wanted to discuss, told me something while I loaded the last of the crates. He said 3 other scattered ships had passed through in the last 2 days alone. Different routes, different headings, none of them aware of the others until they crossed paths at his outpost by pure chance. He said the same thing every time. He told me, nobody knew where they were going. Everybody had the same single word burned into their memory from the moment they left their home station. I asked him if he thought it would work. Whatever this was, whatever we had all become. He shrugged in the particular way of a man who has stopped expecting answers to questions that size, and said that scattering 10,000 grains of sand across an ocean made every single grain very hard to find, but it also made it very hard for those grains to ever come back together again when the time came. That was the cost nobody had bothered to mention in the order. Survival and unity were pulling in opposite directions, and nobody yet knew which one we would be asked to choose when the moment finally arrived. I thought about that for a long time after I left his outpost behind. 2 days later, the Korath found us properly for the first time. Not a search pattern sweeping past in the distance, but a single fighter that dropped out of transit space less than a kilometer off our bow, close enough that I felt the shudder of its arrival through my own hull before I had even registered the alarm. There was no time for the careful, measured choices I had been making for the past week. There was only the fighter, turning toward us with the kind of speed that suggested its pilot had already decided what came next. And the Wayfinder, slow and heavy with 19 lives strapped into seats never designed to survive what was about to happen if I made the wrong choice in the next 4 seconds. I did not think, I reacted, the way 4 years of training had built into muscle long before this night ever needed it, throwing the ship into a dive toward the broken edge of an asteroid field I had been quietly tracking on my scanner for the last 10 minutes without ever expecting to need it. The fighter followed, faster and far more nimble than my battered hauler had any right to outrun, and for nearly a full minute the only sound in the cockpit was the scream of the engines, and the tight, controlled breathing of a pilot trying very hard not to let anyone behind her hear how frightened she actually was. I threaded the Wayfinder between 2 rocks with barely enough clearance to spare, a gap I would not have attempted under any circumstance that did not involve a Korath fighter on my tail, and heard the fighter clip something behind me, a glancing impact that sent it spinning off its line just long enough for me to put a second asteroid between us and break its targeting lock. It did not follow further into the field, whether that was caution, damage, or simple Korath doctrine about not risking a single fighter against unknown terrain. I never learned. I only knew that when I finally came out the other side of the asteroid field, hands aching from how tightly I had been gripping the controls, the scanner behind me was clean. Nobody in the back of the ship said a word for almost 10 minutes. Then the baby began to cry, the ordinary, healthy cry of a child too young to understand what had almost happened, and something about that sound, so completely unconcerned with the universe nearly ending around her, made me laugh before I even understood I was going to. It was not really laughter. It was the only place the fear had left to go. We flew on after that with a little less innocence and a great deal more caution, and somewhere in the back of my mind, the traitor's words kept turning over, slow and patient, refusing to be ignored. Survival and unity were pulling in opposite directions. I did not yet know how that tension would resolve. I only knew that whatever answer was coming, it was still a long way off, and the dark ahead of us showed no sign of running out anytime soon. 4 months passed before the word safe house meant anything to me beyond a phrase from old stories. By then the Wayfinder had become something closer to a small floating village than a ship. 19 people had become 23, picked up 1 or 2 at a time from drifting lifeboats and abandoned distress beacons across half a dozen systems, each new face arriving with its own version of the same story, an alarm, a single word, a scattering. I had stopped asking for details after the first dozen times, because the details were always the same shape even when the names attached to them were not. Felix and his brother, whose name I had finally learned was Dominic, had grown taller in those 4 months in the particular way that children grow, when nobody is watching closely enough to notice it happening day by day. They had taken to helping the newer arrivals settle in, showing them which seats had the least engine vibration, which corner of the cargo hold caught the morning light from the forward viewport. Small kindnesses that cost nothing, and meant everything on a ship where space and comfort were the rarest currencies left. The signal that led us to Ashgate came from an unlikely source, a merchant ship limping through a debris field with half its hull scorched black, crewed by a woman named Priya who had been a logistics officer before the Korath turned, and who recognized something in the careful, evasive way I was flying that told her I was not simply lost. She gave me a frequency, not a location, not yet, just a frequency, and told me to listen on it for 3 days before deciding whether to trust what I heard. I listened. What I heard, buried under enough encryption that it took my onboard systems most of those 3 days to untangle it, was not a military broadcast. It was something closer to a network of whispers, dozens of small signals relayed ship to ship across vast stretches of empty space, each one carrying fragments of information that meant nothing alone but, pieced together, began to form the outline of something far larger than a single scattered fleet. Safe stations, hidden refueling points built in the months since the order had gone out, established by people who had clearly understood from the very beginning that scattering was only the first half of a much longer plan. Coordinates that changed on a rotating schedule, never broadcast twice the same way, designed specifically to be useless to anyone listening who did not already hold the key required to decode them. It took me most of a week to earn that key, which mostly meant proving, system by system, station by station, that I was exactly what I claimed to be. A single scattered ship trying to keep its passengers alive, nothing more, nothing less. Trust in that network was not given. It was built, slowly, the same careful way Toby Quinn and I had built ours over a single fuel line months earlier. Ashgate, when I finally found it, was not a station at all. It was a hollowed-out asteroid, carved out decades earlier by a mining operation long since abandoned, its tunnels repurposed into something between a refugee camp and a fortress. No exterior lights. No broadcast signature beyond the rotating, encrypted frequency that had led me there. From a distance it looked exactly like every other piece of dead rock scattered through that system, which was, of course, the entire point. Inside I found close to 4,000 people. I stood in the main cavern for a long moment after we docked, 23 passengers fanning out behind me into a space that suddenly felt enormous after months spent folded into a ship built for 20, and I understood, finally, fully, what the silence after that single word had actually meant. It had never been an oversight. It had never been panic, or poor planning, or a command structure too broken to give better instructions. It had been the plan from the very first second, built and tested and refined by people far above my pay grade, who understood something the rest of us had needed 4 months of hard, dangerous flying to learn for ourselves. An enemy hunting for a fleet finds a fleet eventually, given enough patience and enough firepower. An enemy hunting for 10,000 grains of sand scattered across an entire galaxy finds, at best, a handful of grains at a time, and loses more ships and more time doing it than the grains themselves were ever worth. We had not been told to run because nobody had a better plan. We had been told to run because running, done correctly, done patiently, done by enough scattered, stubborn people refusing to be found, was the plan. A man named Nathan Cole found me that first night in Ashgate's mess hall, a converted mining cafeteria that still smelled faintly of ore dust beneath the newer smell of recycled stew. He wore a uniform that had been stripped of most of its insignia, deliberately I guessed, the same way every visible marker of rank or unit had clearly been scrubbed from the entire station. He introduced himself as part of what remained of Fleet Command, though he was careful, even there, even 4 months and 1,000 light-years from where the order had first been given, not to use the word command too loudly. He told me what I had already begun to suspect. The order to run had gone out from a small group of officers who understood, before the first Korath ship had even crossed the outer marker, that conventional defense was no longer survivable. 60 years of trade had let the Korath study human fleet movement, human tactics, human command structure. In detail, no enemy should ever have been allowed to gather. A traditional war, fought traditionally, would have ended in weeks. So they had thrown out tradition entirely. 10,000 ships, scattered without coordination, without a rally point, without even the comfort of knowing whether the order made any sense at all, because the not knowing was itself a kind of armor. You cannot break a code you were never given the key to. You cannot anticipate a fleet that has no formation, no leadership structure visible from the outside, nothing but stubborn, scattered survival writ 10,000 times across human space. It was, Nathan admitted, quietly, over a bowl of stew neither of us finished, the most dangerous gamble Fleet Command had ever made. It had cost lives that a more traditional defense might have saved in the short term. Calder Station and a dozen places like it had burned in the opening days, specifically because there had been no fleet left in position to even attempt to defend them. But it had also, slowly, over 4 hard months, started to work. Korath supply lines were stretched thinner than anyone on their side had likely anticipated, forced to hunt across a galaxy's worth of empty space for targets that refused to stay still long enough to be found in any meaningful numbers. Their scout patrols, the same kind I had hidden from near that dead mining platform months earlier, were spread so thin across so many systems that entire stretches of space had gone unpatrolled for weeks at a time, simply because there were not enough ships to cover ground that should never have needed covering against an enemy who was, by design, nowhere and everywhere at once. Ashgate was one of perhaps 24 hidden stations like it, scattered across human space, each one independently discovered or built by survivors who had pieced together the same scattered network of whispers I had spent a week decoding. No central command tied them together, not yet, not in any way a captured ship or a broken code could expose. Just whispers, frequencies, coordinates that changed on a schedule, and an enormous, patient, scattered population of survivors who had turned the act of simply staying alive into the opening move of a war the Korath did not yet know they were fighting. I asked Nathan what came next, whether running was meant to last forever, whether there was ever meant to be a moment when the scattered grains of sand found a reason to come back together. He did not answer directly. He told me instead about a rumor, unconfirmed, passed along the network in pieces too fragmented to fully trust, about a second word. Not yet given, not yet needed, but waiting, somewhere, for the moment Fleet Command judged the Korath stretched thin enough, distracted enough, confident enough in their own slow, grinding hunt across empty space, that 10,000 scattered grains of sand might finally have a reason worth the risk of coming back together at all. I did not sleep well that night, lying in a borrowed bunk carved into solid rock, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a station instead of the constant hum of the Wayfinder's engines. 4 months of running had taught my body to need that hum the way other bodies need silence, and its absence kept me awake long past the point of exhaustion. I thought about Calder Station burning, about Edwin's quiet count of names, finally understood now as exactly what it had been. A man grieving people he had known his entire life, one name at a time, in the only way grief had left to him in the back seat of a stranger's ship. About Toby Quinn, somewhere out in that same vast scattered dark, flying his own heading, alone, the way the plan had asked of him. I thought about the second word Nathan had mentioned, the one not yet given, and I found myself hoping, in a way that surprised me with its intensity, that I would be there to hear it when it finally came. We stayed at Ashgate for 11 days, long enough to refit the Wayfinder properly for the first time since Calder Station, long enough for Felix and Dominic to make friends among the other children sheltering in the asteroid's deeper tunnels, long enough for me to finally sleep through a full night without the engine hum I had grown so strangely dependent on. On the 12th day, a new alarm sounded through Ashgate's tunnels, different from the one that had sent me running 4 months earlier, but carrying the same cold certainty in its tone. A Korath scout had found the asteroid's outer perimeter. 4,000 people did not have 4,000 ships waiting to scatter the way Calder Station's population had. Ashgate had been built as a place to hide, not a place to flee from quickly, and the difference between those two purposes was about to matter more than anyone inside those tunnels had ever wanted to find out. I was halfway back to the Wayfinder before the second alarm finished sounding, weaving through tunnels suddenly full of people moving with the same controlled, practiced urgency I remembered from Calder Station. Except here, 4 months and a hard education later, the movement had a shape to it that Calder had never had time to develop. People were not simply running. They were moving toward stations, toward roles, toward a plan that had clearly been drilled into every resident of that hollowed-out rock long before I had ever arrived. Nathan found me at the docking ring, already half into a flight suit that had seen better decades, and explained in clipped, efficient sentences what Calder Station had never given me the luxury of understanding in advance. Ashgate had defenses. Not fleet grade, nothing close to what a proper military station would have carried before the war began, but enough. A dozen retrofitted fighters, scavenged and rebuilt from wrecks across half a dozen systems, flown by pilots who had spent 4 months learning to fight an enemy that outmatched them in every conventional measure except the one that mattered most. They did not need to win a battle. They needed to buy time for 4,000 people to reach the evacuation ships hidden in the asteroid's deeper tunnels, ships that had been quietly stockpiled and maintained against exactly this possibility since the day Ashgate's first survivors had carved out its first tunnel. I was asked if I would fly. I want to say I hesitated, weighed the 23 lives already depending on the Wayfinder against the 4,000, depending on whoever could get a working ship into that fight, but the truth is simpler and less flattering. I said yes before Nathan had finished asking, because 4 months of running had taught me something I had not fully understood until that exact moment. Standing in a flight suit 2 sizes too large, staring at a dozen scavenged fighters being prepped for a fight none of us were built to win cleanly. Running had never been the opposite of fighting. It had only ever been the first half of it. The Korath scout that had found Ashgate's perimeter was not alone for long. By the time the dozen scavenged fighters cleared the asteroid's hidden launch tunnels, 3 more ships had dropped out of transit space behind it, drawn in by whatever signal the first scout had managed to relay before our defenses could silence it. I took my place in the loose formation, flying a fighter that handled nothing like the Wayfinder, twitchy and overpowered and built by hands far more desperate than skilled, and tried to remember everything 4 years of training and 4 months of running had taught me about staying alive against odds that did not care how hard I tried. The fight that followed lasted 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, a habit from evacuation flying that refused to leave me even in combat, counting down not toward any tactical objective but simply toward the moment Nathan's voice would come through on the comm and tell us the evacuation ships had cleared the tunnels, and we no longer needed to hold. We lost 2 fighters in the first 3 minutes. I did not know the names of the pilots flying them, which felt like its own small failure even as I understood there had been no time, in 11 days, to learn the names of everyone sheltering inside that asteroid. I watched a third fighter take a hit that sent it spinning, trailing fire, toward the rock face of Ashgate itself, and felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the cockpit's failing climate controls. I flew the way the Wayfinder had taught me to fly, not the careful, disciplined patterns of military doctrine I had trained on years earlier, but the desperate, asymmetric weaving that had kept 23 people alive across 4 months of running from an enemy that outmatched us in every conventional sense. I was not fighting the Korath fighters head-on. I was making myself impossible to hit cleanly, buying seconds, buying distance, buying the only currency that mattered in those 11 minutes, which was time. Nathan's voice came through on the comm at the 9-minute mark, steady despite everything, confirming the evacuation ships had cleared the tunnels and reached transit range. The order that followed was not run, not this time. It was disengage, and I had never in my life been so grateful to hear 4 syllables strung together in that particular order. We broke off in a scattered formation that mirrored, in miniature, the same desperate logic that had saved human space 4 months earlier. Not a retreat in formation, which would have given the surviving Korath ships an easy target to chase and finish. A scattering. Every remaining fighter choosing its own heading, its own angle of escape, forcing an enemy with only 4 ships left in the fight to choose which single target was worth chasing, and which 7 were worth letting go. I do not know how many of the dozen fighters made it back to rendezvous with the evacuation convoy in the agreed-upon system 3 transits away. I know that I did, hands shaking on the controls of a borrowed fighter that handled nothing like home, and that when I finally found the Wayfinder again among the scattered evacuation ships, Felix and Dominic were waiting at the docking ramp before the engines had even finished spinning down, and neither of them said a word, only held on, and let me hold on back, for far longer than either of us would have admitted to needing. Ashgate itself, the hollowed-out asteroid that had sheltered 4,000 people for as long as 4 months had allowed, was lost. Whether the Korath destroyed it outright or simply claimed the empty rock once the last evacuation ship cleared its tunnels, I never learned, and I made myself stop wondering, the same way I had made myself stop doing the math on Calder Station's 30,000 all those months earlier. What mattered, what Nathan made sure every surviving pilot understood before the convoy scattered again into its own version of the same careful, patient dark, was that 4,000 people had lived. Not because we had won a battle in any sense that would have impressed a strategist studying the engagement afterward, but because 11 minutes of scattered, desperate, asymmetric defense had bought exactly the time it was meant to buy, and not 1 second more than was needed. It was, Nathan told me quietly, before our convoy split apart into its own scattering of single headings once more, exactly the kind of fight the entire plan had been built around from the very beginning. Not victories. Not yet. Just survival. Purchased one impossible 11-minute stretch at a time, until the day came when survival alone was no longer the only thing on offer. I flew the Wayfinder out of that rendezvous system alone again, 23 passengers behind me, a fighter's worth of new scars on hands that had not stopped shaking since the moment Nathan's voice had said disengage, and somewhere in the dark ahead of me, I understood for the first time that the war the Korath had started was no longer simply happening to us. We had begun, slowly, carefully, one scattered fight at a time, to fight back. 8 months after Calder Station burned, I learned that the galaxy is smaller than it looks when enough desperate people are searching for the same kind of help. I found Toby Quinn again at a refueling depot on the edge of a system with no name worth remembering, his hauler scarred in a dozen new places that had not been there the night we met, his face thinner, harder, carrying the particular tiredness of a man who had spent 8 months proving that running and fighting were never truly separate things. He recognized the Wayfinder before he recognized me, which told its own story about how much both of us had changed since that first careful fuel transfer in the dark. He was not hauling cargo anymore. He had become something the Whisper Network had started calling a runner, a pilot who carried not goods but information, coordinates, warnings, fragments of the growing picture that Fleet Command was slowly assembling from 4,000 scattered reports a week. It was dangerous work in a way that simple evacuation flying had never been, because information was exactly the kind of cargo the Korath had learned, slowly and at great cost to us, was worth hunting hardest. He told me he had been looking for ships like mine, ones that had proven, through months of survival, that their pilots could be trusted with more than their own safety. He asked if the Wayfinder, and the family she now carried, would be willing to take on a second purpose alongside the first. I looked back at 23 faces that had become, somewhere in those 8 months, something closer to 30, new arrivals folded into the same patient rhythm the older passengers had taught them. Felix and Dominic had taken charge of teaching the youngest children their letters using a salvage data slate, an act of ordinary stubborn hope that had nothing to do with war, and everything to do with refusing to let the Korath take more than they had already taken. I told Toby yes, on one condition. Whatever I carried, whatever risk I took on, it could never come at the cost of the lives already depending on me to simply keep flying. He agreed without hesitation, because he understood, better than almost anyone I had met since Calder Station, exactly what that condition cost to honor. The work itself was simple in description and brutal in practice. Carry sealed data packets between safe stations, never knowing their full contents, trusting the encryption to protect both the information and the people relying on it. Avoid contact wherever possible. Scatter immediately if contact became unavoidable. The same lessons that had kept 23 people alive for 8 months applied just as well to carrying a galaxy's worth of scattered secrets from one hidden station to the next. I flew 3 runs in the following month without incident, each one a small, careful victory that added almost nothing to the larger war except proof that the network itself was holding, that the Whispers were reaching where they needed to reach, that 10,000 scattered grains of sand had found, against every reasonable expectation, a way to speak to each other without ever standing still long enough to be caught doing it. The 4th run was different. I was carrying a packet between two stations I had run before, a route I had begun to think of, foolishly, as safe, when a Korath patrol dropped out of transit space directly across my path, with a precision that told me, even before the first targeting lock chimed across my console, that this had never been chance. Someone, somewhere along the route, had been compromised or watched or simply unlucky enough to be tracked, and I had walked the same predictable path one time too many. I scattered the way I had been trained to, throwing the wayfinder into the kind of desperate asymmetric flying that had become second nature since that first night fleeing Calder Station, and for a long, breathless stretch of minutes, it seemed to be working. The patrol's lead fighter lost my trail twice, recovered it once, and I was beginning to believe I might actually clear the engagement with nothing worse than a few new gray hairs to add to the others Calder Station had already given me. Then Toby's hauler dropped out of transit space behind the Korath patrol, drawing every targeting sensor on that side of the fight directly onto himself. I did not understand in the moment why he had done it. I understood it perfectly a few seconds later, watching on my rear scanner as his much larger, much slower hauler took a hit meant for the smaller, faster target the patrol had clearly been favoring a moment earlier. He had not stumbled into that engagement by accident. He had been running the parallel route, close enough to monitor my frequency, and the instant my distress chime crossed his comm, he had made the only choice his particular stubbornness had ever really allowed him to make. I broke off my own evasive pattern and turned back, which every careful lesson of the past 8 months told me was exactly the wrong thing to do, the thing that risked turning one compromised ship into two. I did it anyway, because some lessons only hold until the moment a debt comes due, and I owed Toby Quinn a debt that had started with a fuel line in the dark and grown, slowly, into something I did not have a clean word for. His hauler was already burning by the time I reached comm range, drifting on a trajectory that would carry it, eventually, into the gravity well of a dead moon nobody had bothered naming. I asked him, voice tighter than I wanted it to be, what he needed. Nothing, he told me. He needed nothing. Because the packet he had been carrying, the real reason the patrol had been waiting on that particular stretch of space, was already transmitted, relayed in the half-second window between the first hit and the moment his main systems failed. He had done exactly what a runner was meant to do. He had gotten the information through, even if the ship carrying it never would. I told him to abandon the hauler, to take an escape pod, to give me a heading and I would meet him there no matter what it cost. He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than I wanted it to, and when he spoke again, his voice had the particular calm of a man who had already done the arithmetic and found only one answer that balanced. The escape pod's beacon would draw the same patrol that had already found us once. A second target, slower, easier, sitting still in open space, waiting to be claimed. He told me, instead, to finish what we had both started, 8 months earlier, in the dark above a system that did not have a name worth remembering. He told me to keep flying. He told me, in words simple enough that I have never once forgotten them, that he was glad the fuel line had held. The comm went quiet before I could answer him. I do not know if the patrol found the drifting hauler or simply lost interest in a ship already burning and going nowhere fast. I did not stay to find out because staying would have meant exactly the kind of compromise he had given everything to prevent. I flew the rest of that route alone, the way I had flown most of the past 8 months, and arrived at the destination station 3 hours later with a packet of my own information that meant nothing compared to what his sacrifice had already purchased. I grieved him the same way I had grieved Edwin, the way I had grieved Calder Station itself, in the quiet hours of a cockpit at 2 a.m. ship time, with 30 people sleeping behind me who had never met him, and would never fully understand why their pilot sat staring at a dark viewport for far longer than the moment seemed to call for. It was 3 weeks later, at a safe station I had never visited before, that Nathan Cole found me again, older somehow despite the relatively short time since Ashgate, and told me something that gave Toby's last transmission a weight I had not yet understood. The packet he had died carrying had not been routine. It had been the final piece of a picture fleet Command had spent nearly a year assembling, a complete, confirmed map of Korath's supply routes stretched thin enough, scattered enough, distracted enough by a year of hunting 10,000 grains of sand, that the long-rumored second word finally had a date attached to it. Not run, this time. Something else entirely, and for the first time in nearly a year, every scattered ship in human space was about to be asked, all at once, to stop running in the same direction they had been running in for so long, and turn around. Nathan did not give me details that night. The network had not survived a year of war by handing its secrets to every runner who asked for them, even ones who had earned as much trust as I had. He told me only that every safe station across human space was being asked to prepare, quietly, without drawing attention, for a single coordinated transmission that would arrive on a date none of us yet knew, carrying instructions that would matter more than anything since the very first word had sent us scattering in the first place. In the meantime, there was still a war to survive one ordinary day at a time, And ordinary days, I had learned across that long, hard year, were never actually ordinary at all. The safe station where Nathan found me was larger than Ashgate had been, built into the hollowed remains of an old shipping hub rather than an asteroid, with proper docking bays and a school that had grown, in the months since its founding, to nearly 200 children. Felix and Dominic, now old enough to help teach rather than simply learn, spent most of our 6-day stay there working alongside instructors who had once been engineers and accountants and station administrators before the war turned every steady profession into something closer to improvisation. I found Priya there as well, the logistics officer whose scorched merchant ship had first pointed me toward Ashgate's frequency nearly a year earlier. Her own ship had been refit twice since then, each time carrying a little more capability, a little more armor, the slow accumulation of small advantages that a year of scattered, patient resistance had finally begun to add up into something resembling real strength. She had heard about Toby. Everyone on the network, it seemed, had heard about Toby by then. His name passed quietly from ship to ship the way names of the lost always traveled fastest, carried by people who understood exactly what kind of debt they owed him, even if they had never met him directly. She told me something I had not expected to hear, sitting across a narrow table in the station's crowded mess hall, while Felix and Dominic helped serve a meal to children who had arrived only days earlier, with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. She told me the network had a name for ships like mine, for pilots who had spent a year proving, run after careful run, that they could be trusted with more than their own survival. They called us anchors, not because we held still, since stillness had never once been safe, but because everywhere we went, the people behind us held together. A small, stable point of trust in a galaxy that had spent a year teaching everyone exactly how easily things could come apart. I did not feel like an anchor. I felt, most days, like a woman barely keeping ahead of her own exhaustion, carrying grief for Edwin and Toby in the same quiet hours I carried fuel calculations and ration counts, doing the only thing I had ever really known how to do since the night Calder Station burned, which was hold a heading and keep flying it. But sitting there, watching Felix patiently explain a meal portion to a frightened 6-year-old who had lost an entire station of her own only days earlier, I understood, perhaps for the first time, that holding a heading had never been a small thing at all. It had been, every single day for a year, the exact thing that kept a scattered, hunted species from coming apart entirely. We left the safe station 4 days later, with the Wayfinder's hold a little fuller, her hull a little more sound, and 31 passengers now instead of 30, having taken on one more lost child found drifting in an escape pod that had run nearly out of air before our scanners caught her beacon. Nathan gave me a single instruction before we parted ways again into our separate scattered headings. Stay reachable. Stay ready. The second word was coming, and when it did, every ship in the network would need to answer it within hours, not days. I flew back out into the dark with that instruction settled somewhere alongside the grief and the exhaustion and the stubborn, unkillable hope that had carried 23 people, and then 30, and then 31, across a year that should have broken all of us a dozen times over and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, had not. The weeks that followed carried their own ordinary dangers, the kind that no longer felt extraordinary after a year of living inside them. A near miss with a Korath supply convoy that nearly mistook the Wayfinder's heat signature for something worth investigating. A fuel crisis solved at the last possible hour by a trade I would not have dared attempt a year earlier, when I had still believed the galaxy operated by rules instead of by the patient, careful trust the Whisper network had taught me to rely on instead. Then, on an ordinary morning that gave no warning of what it carried, every scanner on the Wayfinder lit up at once with a single encrypted transmission, broadcast simultaneously, I would later learn, to every safe station and every scattered runner across the entire stretch of what remained of human space. I decoded it with hands that had not shaken like that since the night I fled Calder Station, and read the single word that had taken an entire year, 10,000 scattered ships, and more losses than any of us would ever fully count, to finally earn the right to be spoken. Return. I sat staring at that single word for longer than I should have, given that 31 people behind me were about to need every ounce of steady attention I had left to give. Return did not come with coordinates, not at first. The same careful caution that had defined every piece of the network since its earliest days. A second transmission followed within the hour, this one routed through 3 layers of encryption I had never seen used before, carrying a rally point that meant nothing to me on its own, a set of numbers pointing to empty space at the edge of a system I had never visited, and a window of time measured in hours rather than days. I gathered the Wayfinder's family in the cargo hold, all 31 of them, the way I had not done since the earliest weeks of running, when every decision still felt like it needed to be explained out loud. I told them what I knew, which was very little, and what I believed, which was a great deal more. I told them that whatever came next would not be easy, that the year of scattered survival behind us had been the quiet half of something larger, and that the loud half was about to begin. Felix, taller now than I like to admit, old enough that his voice had begun the slow, uneven climb towards something deeper, asked the only question that mattered. Was it finally time to stop running? I told him I did not know yet. I told him it was time to find out. The journey to the rally point took 11 hours. The Wayfinder pushed harder than I had pushed her since the night I tore her off Calder Station's deck, and somewhere in the 4th hour, my scanner began picking up other ships converging on the same heading. First one, then 3, then more than I could count cleanly on a single display. Haulers and fighters and battered evacuation shuttles just like mine, all of them answering the same single word, all of them arriving from 100 different directions at once. The scattered grains of sand finally, after a full year, beginning to remember what it felt like to move as something larger than themselves. I found Nathan's ship near the center of the gathering swarm, and Priya's not far behind it, and for one strange, overwhelming moment, floating in open space surrounded by more human ships than I had seen in a single place since before Calder Station burned, I understood the true size of what a year of patient, stubborn scattering had actually built. Not 10,000 grains of sand anymore. Something closer to an ocean, quiet until now, finally remembering how to move all at once. The briefing that followed, relayed ship to ship across a tight, heavily shielded channel, came from a voice I did not recognize, calm in the particular way that suggested years of command experience, rather than the desperate improvisation most of us have been living inside for the past 12 months. The voice explained, in plain terms, exactly what a year of scattered intelligence gathering, carried ship to ship by runners like Toby Quinn, had finally assembled into a single coherent picture. The Korath fleet, stretched across a galaxy's worth of empty space, hunting 10,000 scattered targets for a full year, had grown thin in exactly the places that mattered most. Their central supply hub, the single point through which every fuel convoy and every replacement fighter ultimately had to pass, sat defended by a fraction of the force it would have carried a year earlier, because every other ship in their fleet had been pulled away into the long, grinding, largely fruitless work of chasing shadows across human space. We were not being asked to win a war in a single engagement. We were being asked to do something far more specific and far more achievable. Strike the supply hub hard enough, fast enough, to force the Korath command structure to make an impossible choice. Pull ships back from their scattered hunt to defend a hub that was suddenly, finally, worth defending, or lose the supply lines that had kept that scattered hunt running for a full year in the first place. Either choice would buy human space something it had not had since the night the order first went out. Room to breathe, room to rebuild, room, perhaps, for the war to finally begin shifting in a direction that did not end with every grain of sand eventually ground down by patient enough hunting. I was assigned, along with a dozen other ships that had proven themselves over the past year as steady, reliable, willing to fly exactly the kind of desperate asymmetric patterns that scattering had taught us all, to the escort group. Our task was not to strike the hub directly. It was to protect the slower, heavier ships carrying the actual weapons capable of doing real damage. The same role I had played without realizing it that night above Ashgate. Buying time, buying distance, making myself impossible to hit cleanly while something larger and more important moved through the space I was protecting. The battle, when it finally began, did not look like the stories I remembered from before the war, the clean formations and decisive single moments that old training simulations had always tried to teach. It looked like a year of scattered survival finally turned inward on a single point, hundreds of ships arriving from 100 different headings at once. The same chaotic, unpredictable pattern that had kept us alive for 12 months now turned, deliberately, into a weapon. I flew the Wayfinder through the opening minutes the same way I had flown her through every dangerous stretch of the past year, weaving, scattering, refusing to hold a pattern long enough to be predicted, drawing 2 separate Korath fighters away from the heavy strike ships behind me, and leading them on a chase through a debris field that I had studied on approach with exactly the same careful attention I had once given the asteroid field near that dead mining platform, a lifetime and 12 months ago. Somewhere behind me, the strike ships reached the hub. I did not see what happened there directly. I only felt it, a distant tremor through open space that even the Wayfinder's hull registered, and heard, over the tight command channel, the calm voice that had briefed us confirm what every scattered survivor in that fight had spent a year hoping to hear. The hub's primary defenses were down. The strike ships were through. The 2 fighters chasing me broke off without warning, peeling away in the same sudden, coordinated retreat I watched ripple outward across my scanner, as ship after ship of Korath fighters abandoned their engagements at once. Recalled, I understood later, by a command structure finally forced into the impossible choice the briefing had predicted. pull back and save what remained of the supply hub, or press forward and lose it entirely, while their hunting fleet stayed scattered across a galaxy that no longer had any targets worth the cost of finding. They pulled back. I sat in the cockpit of the Wayfinder for a long moment after the last Korath signature cleared my scanner, hands finally steady in a way they had not been steady since the night Calder Station burned, and listened to 31 people behind me slowly begin to understand, the way I was only just beginning to understand myself, that the fight was actually over. Not the war, not yet, but the fight, this single, enormous, coordinated fight that a full year of patient scattering had been quietly building toward the entire time. The supply hub did not fall completely that day. It did not need to. A year of grinding, stretched-out hunting had already cost the Korath more than their command structure had ever planned to spend, and the strike against their central hub, however incomplete, was enough to force something that had not happened since the very first ship fled Calder Station's burning ring. They began to retreat. Not everywhere, not all at once, but system by system over the following weeks, scattered word reaching us across the same patient network that had carried Toby Quinn's final transmission a year earlier. Korath patrols pulling back from territory they no longer had the ships to hold, fuel they no longer had the supply lines to spare, confidence they no longer had the unbroken winning streak to support. I flew the Wayfinder home eventually, though home had become a complicated word over the course of that year, no longer a single station or a single planet, but something closer to the entire network of safe stations and scattered ships that had kept 31 people, and thousands like them, alive long enough to see this day arrive. We settled, in the end, at the same hollowed-out shipping hub where Nathan had told me about anchors, where Felix and Dominic had spent their evenings teaching letters to children who had lost everything else, because it was the closest thing to a place either of them had called home in longer than either cared to count. I think about Calder Station often, even now, about Edwin's quiet count of names, finished, I hope, somewhere I cannot follow, about Toby Quinn's voice in those last seconds, glad the fuel line had held, a debt I have never once stopped trying to repay through every single person I have managed to keep alive since. I think most of all about that first word, the one that asked an entire species to scatter into the dark with no destination, no rally point, no comfort beyond a single syllable, and the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, enough of us would land. Run, it told us, and we ran, into a year that asked more of every scattered, frightened, stubborn one of us than any of us believed we had left to give. We gave it anyway, and in the end, the running was never really the opposite of fighting back. It was simply how we learned to. The peace that followed did not arrive all at once, the way peace rarely does after a war fought without a single clean battlefield to mark its ending. It came instead the same way the resistance itself had come, in scattered pieces, system by system. A Korath envoy finally reaching out through a Channel Fleet command had kept open for exactly that purpose. Careful negotiations stretched across months rather than days. Every concession measured against a full year of losses on both sides that neither side could fully undo. I was not in the room for those negotiations. Few of us were. We had spent a year learning to be scattered and patient, and it turned out those same qualities served just as well in the slow work of building a peace as they had in the desperate work of surviving long enough to reach one. What I did instead, in the months that followed the strike on the supply hub, was something closer to the work I had always actually been suited for. I flew. Not running anymore. Not exactly. Though the habits of a year spent evading capture did not leave a person easily or quickly. I carried supplies between the safe stations that had kept human space alive through the worst of it, ferried families finally able to consider returning to systems the Korath had abandoned, helped rebuild, in small careful pieces, the kind of network that peacetime would need just as much as war ever had. Calder Station itself was gone, its ring reduced to drifting debris that nobody had yet found the resources or the will to fully clear. I visited the wreckage once, nearly 2 years after the night I had fled it with 20 strangers and a cracked undercarriage, and stood at the Wayfinder's viewport for a long time, looking at the slow, silent drift of metal that had once held 30,000 lives, before I finally found the words I had been carrying since the night Edwin counted names in the back seat of my ship. I did not say them out loud. Some things are not meant for voice. I only held the heading steady, the same way I had held it through every dark stretch of that long year, and let the silence stand in for whatever words might have come close to enough. Felix turned 16 that year, old enough by then to take the pilot seat beside me on short hauls between stations, steady hands that had grown up watching exactly how a person holds a heading when holding it is the only thing left to do. Dominic had taken to teaching full-time at the rebuilt school on the old shipping hub, patient in a way that reminded me, more than I ever told him, of Edwin's quiet, careful counting. The youngest of the children I had carried out of a dozen different burning systems were old enough now to barely remember a galaxy that had not already learned how to scatter and survive and, eventually, come home. I never flew with a crew of exactly 20 again. The number had grown and shrunk and grown again across 2 years of war, and the slow, uneven peace that followed it, faces arriving and faces moving on to lives of their own, the way a found family always eventually does. But the Wayfinder herself never stopped flying, patched and repatched until barely a single original plate remained on her hull, a ship that had outlived the cracked undercarriage I tore her free with on the worst night of my life, and the war that had nearly cost every single person ever lucky enough to find shelter behind her. I think, sometimes, about the version of myself who stood frozen in that mess hall doorway, coffee spreading across a table I never went back to clean, hearing a single word with no explanation attached, and choosing, in the space of a single heartbeat, to run rather than freeze. I do not know if that choice made me brave. I have never fully believed bravery was the right word for simply doing the next necessary thing, because the alternative was unthinkable. What I do know is this: a galaxy that scatters does not break the same way a galaxy that stands and fights too soon breaks. We were asked to become 10,000 grains of sand thrown into the wind, trusting a plan none of us could see the shape of yet, and we did it, every frightened one of us. Because the voice that gave the order asked it of us at exactly the moment trust was the only resource any of us had left to spend. It cost more than any of us were ever told it would cost, going in. It always does. But I think about Toby Quinn's voice in those last seconds, glad the fuel line had held, and I understand, more clearly now than I did on the night I first heard it, that the word we were given was never really about fleeing at all. It was the first move in the only fight we were ever going to be able to win. I still fly the Wayfinder out past the edge of every system I visit, just far enough to see the open dark stretching away in every direction. The same dark that swallowed Calder Station and gave it back to us. 2 years in a war and more losses than I will ever finish counting later, as something we had earned the right to call home again. I do not run anymore. I have not needed to in a long while. But I remember exactly how, and on the nights when the stars feel a little too quiet, I find I am still grateful that I do.